Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, where the topic is how to optimize resources in a constrained economy. My name is Doug Wellesby, and I'm the Partner Channel Manager here at WICRESOFT. I'm also joined by my colleagues Jim Patterson, our Director of Sales, and Matt Willey, our OnePlan Product Specialist. During today's webinar, attendees will be on mute and the line will not be open for questions. However, feel free to use the GoToWebinar question feature to submit questions. I will address these during the webinar and will respond via email if we do not get to your specific question. If for some reason you get distracted or pulled away from the webinar, no need to worry, as I will be emailing a link to the presentation once it has been posted to our YouTube channel. I'll now turn the presentation over to Jim.
Thanks, Doug. Welcome, everybody. We're excited to present this topic to you today. You know, especially given where we're at with the COVID-19 pandemic and such, you know, businesses, that's just the latest iteration of business challenges and economy and business landscape changes that businesses have to respond to in the marketplace. And we're going to talk today about, regardless of what challenges we're facing or changes out there in the market landscape or economic conditions, how do we optimize resources in that constrained economy, whatever the rationale for that might be. So let's use COVID-19 as an example. You know, there is a business impact, you know, more in some businesses than others. And we do have to, in some shape or fashion, as organizations, respond to that crisis or that set of circumstances. So organizations need to respond in order to meet the economic changes and adjust to the realities that we are all confronted with at these points in times. Also, though, as organizations move from the initial crisis response towards an eventual recovery, we must be able to develop and execute strategies for starting the business based on whatever new set of constraints or set of circumstances that we are looking at. In each stage of crisis to recovery, though, we must have the ability to evaluate options and scenarios of possible corrective actions that we want to take, because it may not be clear and we may indeed have different forks in the road that we may need to choose from. Now, you know, the Gartner Group just did a recent survey and did a quick COVID-19 survey of finance leaders in April, and just looking at what the cost reduction actions to be taken in May and June of this year. So this is all very recent. And if you look at after you get through the freeze travel and entertainment and cancel leadership and events and offsites, you know, number 4, we start getting down to labor related types of things, where it's reducing consulting and contractor spend and freeze hiring or delay or freeze hiring offers, or, you know, offers. Furloughing staff is not down below much more farther than that, and reduce working hours. So sometimes from a finance perspective, when you're faced with a crisis or an immediate need, the reaction is, how do we cut costs? And the focus is on the cost reduction only in many cases as we go through that. And that may or may not be the best course of action. What we need to do is we need to strike some type of balance, and we need to evaluate staffing levels in uncertain times. And then during these times of economic uncertainty, we got to evaluate how these workforce reductions that we are planning to do will impact the delivery of services for both the keeping the business open or business continuity, as well as the business outcomes we're trying to achieve overall, both now and longer term. We don't want to sacrifice one for the other necessarily. We really need to balance the need for cost reductions with the continued enablement of the business outcomes we need to achieve, as well as really not just kill innovation, because in many industries, innovation is the lifeblood. And if we don't innovate, we'll die. More than just from the impacts of things like the pandemic. So common challenges and errors. We have a picture here of unintended consequences, and eventually you can see what's going to happen to this gent sitting in his chair. But if we have, oftentimes organizations may fail to align their investment and related staffing levels to the business outcomes that are desired, like we talked about earlier on. And they may focus more on short-term or budget cost implications when faced with the immediate pressures rather than long-term sustainability. And if we cut services and staff associated with providing those services that contribute to those business outcomes, ultimately the net effect could be we could be limiting the value our organization can deliver overall, both now and in the future. So we don't want to just be reactionary, because a reactionary or an undisciplined approach to cost and staffing reductions, may result in unintended consequences like this guy in the comic. And when economic conditions improve, it may limit or severely impact our enterprise's ability to recover commensurate with the way the economy and other things may recover. So some considerations in cost and value optimization is that we want to align future value impacting deliverables in our organization by mapping efforts and staffing requirements to them. And in right-sizing the enterprise staffing levels, we want to include those allocated within business units to ensure that each role is properly placed and that the enterprise's strategic priorities are met, even as we are responding to a rapidly changing economic climate. Even if it's the bare minimum, we want to keep the things that need to keep going, and also look at the future to make sure that we can do the things in the future that we want to. And oftentimes we do this on a role basis, and role segmentation is a term that can be used where we prioritize the roles and types of resources that we need and the subsequent contributions towards enabling those business outcomes, and making sure we have a sufficient or at least a minimum viable amount of those resource roles to continue on, and making sure that we don't hamstring the organization moving forward. Now, in an overall resource management approach, we may take different resource management steps as we go through different levels of resource management maturity in an organization. And when we're in a time of crisis, we don't have time to do a phased rollout of these types of things. What we really want to do is focus on the things at hand that we can address now, and make sure we respond as quickly as we can and put our plans in place and evaluate scenarios that impact these. So out of those steps in that prior slide, the one that we really can focus on is resource capacity, because resource capacity is something at a top-down level where we can look at things from a role basis and what's required and what we might need, and maybe a little bit of resource allocation and who specifically, people name-wise, we may put against specific work efforts. But from a sanity check perspective, resource capacity is going to give us an indication: do we have enough people, or do we have the right mix of people in order to keep things going within the organization, and also focus on that as we ramp back up as we go into recovery. So in understanding resource capacity, what do we mean? So if we look at the demand versus capacity piece from the top and bottom segment of this graphic, capacity is how many people do we have that can work on projects, and for how much time are they available, and what roles can they play, getting back to that role basis piece. Demand is really looking at the portfolio and the pipeline of things that we're looking to do for those business outcomes, and we determine the resources required for each project. But then we also have to prioritize those projects and initiatives, and then be able to allocate based upon role and priority until the resources are exhausted, meaning we don't have any more. And as the level of those resources, based on our ramping up and ramping down resource levels to respond to economic conditions, we have to strike that balance to where capacity is as close to demand as we can make it. Ultimately, we want to develop a project plan or a portfolio based on committed availability, and not start projects unless resources are available. This is the delicate balance that we're facing, but we can't do resources in a vacuum. We have to look at it as the initiatives that are driving the business outcomes, and making sure that we understand which ones we must do and prioritize accordingly. So if we think about use of role-based planning, if we think about ideas and requests and projects and business cases that feed into a portfolio, and identifying the roles, et cetera, and the resource types that we have in an organization, where they intersect is at the time where we have a proposed portfolio and we've prioritized those things, and we're trying to then determine, can we match our capacity with our demand? And as we reduce staffing levels potentially during something like the pandemic, we have to then accordingly reprioritize our portfolio, or change the timing of those portfolios such that we can actually meet those demands, and making sure that we're working on the right things and allocating the remaining resources that we have at that point to the things that are going to generate the most value and the most sustainability for our organization. So how do organizations manage resources today? Well, as we respond and get reactive to these things, people jump into Excel. And why do they do that? Well, it's freely available. We all know how to use it to some degree. and may be unaware of other alternatives. But that seems to be what people resort to in times like this. Now, the problems with Excel is that it's very individual. People model things in different ways, and no matter how they model it, it is a manual and a static model that people change things row by row, cell by cell, and as things change from a timing and other perspective, you have to then make those changes very laboriously across the entire spreadsheet. It's also easy to break formulas and calculations so things don't roll up or calculate like you want. And it's time consuming to do things that change. And then for the most part, it's disconnected from your project portfolio and other project management information that you'd be using that resource information with. So the idea here is that it's maybe a good thing from a one-dimensional resource headcount plan, but it doesn't dovetail with anything else you might be wanting to do in managing the rest of your portfolio of initiatives. So transformative options to do this better would be to have comprehensive solutions with embedded processes and a centralized data store for all dimensions of this project and resource information, such that you have actionable intelligence that factors in all aspects and that they are related to one another all through your process. To that end, we're going to be talking today about one plan, and this is where we can connect strategy to execution. At the top level, we're going to be talking about portfolio planning, resource planning, and how that may even result in some financial planning that we might look at as we look at the impacts and scenarios. Ultimately, we can tie these things to the execution pieces that you see in the lower portion of this graphic, but we're not going to focus on that aspect of it today. We have visual resource capacity planning for individual projects that Matthew will be showing you here shortly. We can then look at what those demands versus capacity are for these resource roles and individual resources organization-wide. We can then leverage that resource information in portfolio analysis, and as we prioritize our portfolio, we can factor in the resource implications and even the finance implications around that. So the financial implications can be modeled or even be derived from the resource plans that we have within the system. And then the reporting and the analytics can be a natural output as we're looking into the data that we're accumulating in this central repository of rich information. Now, we can provide this one plan capability anywhere in your Microsoft cloud. It's built on the Microsoft Office 365 and Power Platform, and we can surface this capability in Microsoft Teams or Project Online or Azure DevOps or SharePoint or Dynamics. But today we're going to focus on the things that people are using very widely today, which is Microsoft Teams. It gives us the ability in Microsoft Teams to make this to be a hub of teamwork in Microsoft 365 for your project, portfolio, and resource management and capacity needs, along with all the other things that Teams does regarding collaboration and content and chatting and meetings and content management, other pieces that you may want to bring together into the mix. So in the example we're going to show you today, if you think about Teams being in the center, where we may have our collaboration and our conversations and our content sharing and our document repositories and our ability to keep notes from a particular project or initiative or set of projects in a central place, and the reporting being accessible from within that, one plan is also a dimension of those pieces that we can look at. And Matthew will show you what we mean by the different dimensions of one plan. So with that, let's focus on the demonstration pieces, and Matthew, why don't you take it away?
Sounds good. Thank you, Jim. All right, share my screen here. Okay, so I'm logged in here into Teams, as Jim just mentioned, and I'm in a group that we've named EPMO. And you could call the group whatever you want, but in this case, this is essentially the group in Teams where people can come who are taking part in portfolio management types of activities. Today with the focus on resource management, but other things could be done from within here as well as needed. At the same time, I can take advantage of the Teams capabilities as well, though. So while you're communicating and collaborating, if you need to post updates on what's going on within your organization, so on and so forth, those things could happen here, say in your posts in the different channels that you can have within Teams. I can also store files and different documents, templates for people, whatever they may want. But where we're going to focus in today is on this portfolio tab here. So when I click on the portfolio tab, essentially what it's doing is taking me into my portfolio view here within one plan, but still within the whole Teams realm, so I can have access to lots of other capabilities as well, and or other tools I might be utilizing to kind of all here from one place. It gives you a portal, so to say, to go for all things portfolio management related. I'm going to put this into full screen mode so we have a little bit more room here to look at things. But essentially what I'm looking at is a list of all of my different projects that are going on. In this case, they're grouped up by portfolio, but it could be by program or department or however you want to organize things. And we'll see, when we see here some high-level statuses, how are we doing from an overall health perspective, schedule health, financial health, etc. Some of these projects are in a proposed state. They haven't yet started. Some are active, some are on hold. And so in various different states, but this is my one pane of glass, my one place to go to kind of see all my projects and what's happening. From there, I'm going to go ahead and click into one of these projects, my VoIP phones project. And we can take a look at what it looks like to go and build out a resource plan within Teams here. So you can see I already have a high-level resource plan that was built for this particular project, VoIP phones, and I have specific resources that I'm asking for. When you build out your resource plan, you can use either named resources or generic resources if you don't quite know who's going to be working on it yet. So for example, Daniel Williams is a project manager. I think I'm going to need another project manager, but I don't quite know who it's going to be yet. So I'm using a generic here just as a placeholder so we can still better understand the resource requirements for this particular project. Over here on the right, then we can specify how much we need those resources for. And you can do that planning either in hours, in percents, or FTEs, and you can switch around at any point, whatever you would like. So if I want to do FTEs or full-time equivalents, I could come in and say I need one full-time person, and I can simply come in here and key in one and specify that as such. Or 0.5 would be half-time, so on and so forth. If you want to plan in hours, though, you absolutely can as well. Again, it does all the calculations for you, and it's flexible in either which way. But now what we know from this is, okay, here are all the resources we think we're going to need to work on this particular project and for what period of time. This is very different than building out a project schedule, right? I didn't create any tasks. I'm not saying that you're going to work on these 10 tasks on this date. High-level, top-down planning, saying, I think I'm going to need these resources for this period of time, and I need them full-time, part-time, or other, something like that, right? So now we have a lot better idea of how what the requirements are going to be for this project. But within some of the uncertain times that are going on right now, what we did was we added in a status column here, and you can see that some of these resources are actually on furlough. For whatever reason it might be, whether it's reducing costs or they just can't work from home and it's not safe or legal for them to be on site, depending on your business and the job, whatever it might be. If people are now unavailable for whatever which reason, we can tag those as such. And now as the project manager of this project, I know that I have to go and try to get some other resources to help out on this project. Sometimes that's on the project manager to go find and look. Sometimes it's on a resource manager to do that process as well and figure out who we're going to switch in, and or if we're going to need to delay this project, put it on hold, whatever it might be. So let's look at that next. So this is more of the project manager's view of things, looking at one project at a time in the resource plan for that project and kind of seeing where some of my issues are. If I wanted to go search and try to find possible replacements, then I can pop open here what we call the candidates grid, and I'm going to say find resources, and let's say I want to find a substitute for Yukari here because she's on furlough, she's a developer. So I'm going to say I want to go find by role a new developer. We can come in here, see who's available, and then I can filter this out by status and make sure I'm just looking at active resources, not resources that are also on furlough. You can't switch a furlough with a furlough. And you can see here that WoFat actually has some availability coming up. So he's a developer. He's already set to work on a few other projects, but not for a while. So maybe that's a fit. So I can select WoFat here, select Yukari, and then just do a replace, and that'll switch them out. If you choose to do so, you can have what we call turned on, which is called resource negotiations, where essentially when you do that, it's going to trigger an approval request to the proper resource manager. Essentially, who's WoFat's resource manager? They'll be able to approve that and or suggest someone else, and you can kind of work with a resource manager or department manager, whoever may be managing that resource, to come to an agreement on who you can use for how long, so on and so forth. But this is more kind of the project manager's day in the life and the view of what they could see from a resource perspective. With that, why don't we go ahead and switch over to what it looks like from a resource manager's perspective. Now I'm switching into a view here. It looks very similar, but it's not just looking at one project. This is looking across all of my different resources and across a variety of different projects. So we can see who is working on what projects and when they're working on those projects. And if they're over allocated or not, you'll see that they show up red within a particular period of time. And right now I'm looking at this by month, but I could also flip this to look at it by quarter or by year at whatever level of detail that I'm looking for. And I can also filter this down and or group this up to see where I might be having issues. For example, if I come here and I group this by role, now it's not showing me all of the individual resources, of which I may have many, possibly thousands of resources. Hopefully I'm not responsible personally for all of those, but maybe. And you can see here that we're grouping it up by role, and we can see where particular roles are constrained. So you can see we're having some issues in February and March with project managers where they're going to be over allocated, and they're going to have to kind of stretch themselves. I can then drill in one more layer, see all those individual project managers, who's the most over allocated and not, and maybe at least try to spread that work out a little bit better so that any one person isn't, too over allocated, which will then put those projects at risk. Under a particular person, I can see what they're set to work on. You can see Daniel Williams has a ton of things that he's supposed to be working on over the next year or so we're looking at here. Whereas others might have a lot less. So I can simply actually just drag and drop things from one person to another to make some of those adjustments as needed, which will then notify the project manager back on the other side, again, if you have the negotiations feature turned on. So from a resource manager's perspective, I can come in and I can get visibility into all that, and at the same time get visibility into who's active, who's on furlough, so on and so forth. So if Patrick here, though, is on furlough, then I need to get all of his work over to someone else. But we're already having issues with project managers, so maybe we can bring in someone temporarily, a contractor, who knows, whatever it might be, to try to resolve these. Or the opposite is we need to do less projects, maybe put some projects on hold or move them out, so on and so forth. And we'll look at how we can do some what if scenarios around that here in just a second. So this is kind of your one-stop stop, place to go where you can see everything going on from a resource management perspective. And right now we're looking at all just capacity versus demand, but later on I can compare these to the actual scheduled work that ends up getting scheduled in like a project schedule, and or timesheet hours if you're tracking those things right here to see how we actually did comparatively to what we initially planned, all right from within one view. So let's flip back over into the portfolio view, and now from a portfolio management perspective, your steering committee and your executive leadership or whoever it may be who's deciding which projects we're going to do, when we're going to do them, within the constraints that we have. We only have so much resources, we only have so much dollars, and how are we going to get this done, and what new projects are we going to bring in, and how are we going to sequence them based off of priority. We can go through a scenario here of how that can look and work. The first thing I'm going to do, just so we have a little bit more working room here, is I'm going to put this into full screen. So now I have a lot more real estate, while I'm doing some of these kind of higher intensity, let's call them activities here around what if scenarios. And I'm going to flip into my prioritization view, which is going to change essentially what information that we're looking at here within the system. It's all the same projects, but we're looking at some other information here that essentially is going to allow me to prioritize these. So we can see how strategically aligned is a particular project. How much is it going to help us lower costs, improve employee retention? What's the risk? And based off of these different business drivers, we can calculate out a prioritization score, as well as we can look at more financial types of metrics like budget, benefits, ROI, NPV, IRR, any other things that we might want to look at while we're doing this prioritization here. What I can do is I can flip this into prioritization mode, and now I can essentially, while reviewing this information here, make choices around my priorities. The higher priority items are at the top, and the lowest priority items are down at the bottom. And as new projects come into the mix, new proposed projects, I can routinely come in here every so often, maybe every week, every month, every quarter, however frequently you do your kind of planning and prioritization. And I can simply drag and drop to move things around and go, you know what? This is higher priority, this came from the CEO. This is a lower priority, things have shifted and changed, and kind of reorganize and reprioritize. So we know that the top one is our highest priority, the bottom ones are lowest, and then everything else in between. At the same time, there's this isn't yet taking into account our constraints. In this case, we're focusing on resource constraints. And so what I can do is I can overlay a timeline on top of this, or a roadmap if you want to call it that. where you can see all of these different projects when they're planning to be started or when they're asking to be started if they're proposed ones, and or where they currently are if they're already active. And you can also visualize the dependencies between these projects. So if you know, particular projects are tied together, if I'm moving one around, then I need to make sure to move others accordingly as needed. So we can very easily visualize that there. The next layer to bring on top of this is the resourcing. And so I can bring up a view down here in the bottom that's very similar to the resource planning view that we just looked at before, but it's going to allow me to do some what if scenarios to figure out what projects we can do, when we can do them, what are we going to put on hold possibly to try to resolve some of our resource constraints that we may be having right now. And so you'll see that there's some red here within these resources. Right now I'm looking at it, you know, all of my individual resources, but again, I could group this up by say role or business unit and try to understand where my actual constraints are, not just on an individual basis, but kind of on a more rolled up higher level, say by role. So you can see my developers, for example, are going to be having some issues for a good period of time here as we go in. And again, if you want to drill in to get more detail on who's actually having those issues, that's still available when you do this down here. Right now, again, I'm looking at this by month, but I could switch this to by quarter or year, depending on what level of detail that I'm looking for. And so now what I can do is I can create my what if scenarios and go, how are we going to resolve some of these resource constraints? One thing that we could do is we could simply come into our view here, and I can simply drag and drop these different projects. And when I drag and drop and move them, it will update the resource grid below. And so what I'm doing is I'm saying, what if I take maybe some of these lower priority projects and I drag them out a quarter, 2 quarters, whatever it might be? How is that going to affect our resources? If we stagger things better, that's one way of solving the problem. The other is I can come down here and go, what if we take one of these active projects and put it on hold? And if I uncheck the box, that's simply saying, what if we stop working on this? And so I can what if that just by unchecking things, and or if it's a proposed project, I'm saying, what if we just don't do it, or at least not for right now? And so you can come in here and keep checking these until things essentially start to go green or get pretty close to it. And I can drill into more detail and try to figure out which projects are taking the most resources and so on and so forth to try to make some best choices around priority versus the resources that these projects are going to take, and how that's going to affect my timeline of when we can deliver these things as well. So you can kind of balance all of those different pieces of the equation. And once you get a scenario that you want where you go, yep, here's what I think we should do, I can come in and save that as a scenario. You'll see I have a couple already saved in here. I can come back to them at any time and go, okay, scenario A, we need to put these 5 projects on hold. Scenario B, we just need to push out these new proposed projects out 2 quarters maybe. And then as a business, we can try to make some decisions around how we're actually going to solve these problems while staying within our resource constraints. So this can be a really powerful tool for coming up with that high-level top-down portfolio plan of, you know, what are we going to do? And then later on, those projects will actually get executed on, you know, after all of this happens. So pop out of this here, as you're doing all of this resource planning activities and or portfolio planning activities, there's a full set of Power BI reports that you can utilize to visualize and you know, run analysis on top of all of this resource management related data. And so I'll put this into full screen here. This is the out-of-the-box portfolio report. You'll see there's a lot of different tabs in here for everything from costs to project status reports to timesheet reports, etc. So depending on what you're trying to look at, you know, there's things in here that may be of interest to you if I just want to see all my projects and what's their status and such, for example. But today, since we're focusing on resourcing, I'll pop into a couple tabs here. And so you can see there's a full set of resource reports where you can see things like monthly demand by role. So this is showing by month how much resource demand we have versus their capacity. And you can see over the few months here, we have a lot more demand than we have capacity to do. So we have to figure out how to fix that. We can also call attention to problems like who's our most over-allocated resources. You can see them pop up over here in red on the side, and then we can try to drill into that and figure out how we're going to help them out. Maybe we just need to balance the work a little bit better to other people who do have availability. And so on and so forth. So there's a full set of report here if you want to get into more detailed data, which projects are taking which resources and how much. and lots of other different ways that we can look at this, grouped up by role or not, if you want to sum things up, and utilize the different filter sets on the side. If I want to just look at a particular department or just a different role or just a different resource, I can come in here and filter things and just look at the information that makes the most sense for whatever I'm trying to analyze at that particular period of time. So you can start with these pre-built reports, but on top of that, you can configure them, change them, tweak them, and or build other reports from all this robust data that we now have from using this resource management system to manage our capacity and demand across our organization. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back to Jim for a few more closing notes, and then we'll let you guys get out of here.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate the demonstration and bringing these concepts to life. So in summarization of the topics that we covered here today, organizations must respond to crisis and changing business conditions. That actions should ideally involve more than just cost cutting itself. And we need to balance cost reduction with the continued business outcomes and innovation that businesses need as their lifeblood. And that reactionary and undisciplined approaches can bring unintended consequences and make it more difficult to recover when times get better. And high-level capacity planning from a resource perspective is a good place to start if you haven't been doing resource capacity planning already. And also, we need to, as Matt showed you, align and prioritize your portfolio deliverables and then map the effort and staffing levels and the resultant staffing levels that are needed to the business outcomes that we must have as an organization. We showed you that one plan provides a great platform for scenario modeling and analysis capabilities right in the Microsoft Cloud, and that Microsoft Teams as a hub for all of this allows us to bring in other dimensions of conversation and collaboration and content management and even other aspects of applications and information that we might want to relate to during our analysis and working with specific initiatives or portfolios. So a little bit about WICRESOFT. We are a multi-gold certified Microsoft partner with a particular emphasis in project and portfolio management. We help people worldwide, either through our direct organizations or our strategic partners. And we're here to support you in whatever level of support that you might need to help actuate the things that we're showing you here today or even beyond. We have a variety of services, whether it's to implement services like this or solutions like this for you, provide you any education and training you might need to equip your user base, or even any ongoing support or managed services that we can help to provide and augment the staff that you have available to you in your organizations, as well as advisory services on these disciplines like portfolio management, resource management concepts, any transformational types of services and things as well. The idea is we're here to provide the services that you need. Now, if you wanted to try some of the things you saw today in one plan, and optionally even within Teams, we have a trial available on Microsoft's AppSource. If you go into AppSource and go look for the one plan for adaptive portfolio management, you'll be able to try the what if scenario capabilities and resource planning things that we saw here today in Matt's demo. We also can offer you a strategy workshop, which is really a review of your current use of tools, spreadsheets, whatever it is you're using today, and assess your current requirements and your desired future state and determine how to quickly implement or migrate into a new solution to get you the benefits based upon the things that we showed you here today, and give you an implementation roadmap for the best chance of adoption success within your particular culture or organization. And that would include what the total cost of ownership would be in order to make that move. So we're happy to help you with those types of things. So we're happy to give you a strategy workshop session at no charge to do some of those things at a high level. We're also happy to support you with WICRESOFT chaperone support in a trial of these types of solutions. Or even if you're not ready to do that, we gave you a very generalized demonstration today, Matt did. We can personalize and give you a one-on-one demo to map to the requirements and needs of your organization and answer your specific questions that you might have around that. And also, we do these webinars on a regular basis. June 25th, next Thursday, is our next one. And this one is about automating status reporting in a hybrid PPM environment. So taking some of the concepts you saw here today from portfolio, financials, resource management, and all the other aspects around that, and providing just natural outputs of status reporting to meet the needs of an organization without having to have these status reports become construction projects in and of themselves. So there's a link down below there, or you go to our website, and you can sign up just like you did for this webinar. So with that, we'd like to thank you for attending today. Hopefully you got value out of the information that was shared, and we look forward to engaging you down the road. Have a great day.